Get ready for the beginning.
Well, okay.
Well, we're filming.
Wait, who's that going?
We're going.
She's ordered.
Okay, Alilia's on
This way.
Come on, Millie.
Do you want me
Down
to
the
come
line.
too?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll go next if you want.
Jeez. What's that?
I'll go next.
I'll go
They're
next.
trying
I'll
to
go
ace
next.
you out. I love
I'll
it.
go next.
Y'all are such backstabbers. Here we go.
It's kind of dark.
Can we close
Close the blinds.
Yeah, do what you need to do. I don't understand that.
I don't understand that.
Can you close that?
Hey,
Hey, how's it going?
good. How y'all doing?
Doing
Wow.
great.
thank
Look at all these beautiful people.
Hey, beautiful people.
So I want to tell you something, and I'm not making light of this at all, but our school has had a bit of a safety threat with a student who's kind of issued a bit of a threat, and so we have police campus on our presence, and not every student chose to be here, and we understand that. But I got to tell you, last night when this came out, I had several students say to me, I am not going to miss tomorrow's talk with Matt Desmond.
I'm really sorry about your safety threat. I hope everything's okay.
Yeah. I mean, we feel like the community has responded terrifically, the administration, the police, and all that, but, you know, it is a shame, obviously.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. We get those at Harvard a lot, too. And about twice a year, 3 times a year, we have to clear out of a building or something like that. Something will come up. So I know how that is.
So here's the deal. We have despite that, we have kind of a party atmosphere in our room. We have donuts, we have coffee, we have super excited students. I'm going to get the heck out of the way, and for the next 30 minutes, the students really want to pick your brain, okay?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cohn.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Millie.
Hey, Millie.
Hi. So recently we Skyped with former Secretary John Kerry, and his closing remarks to us were that, you know, there's so many issues going on in the world that we should pick one and go full throttle at that. But when we read your book and look at your work, we see that you're tackling lots of issues at once, so public housing, mental health, racial injustice. How important do you think it is to pick one thing? And if you had to pick one, what would it be?
So we're starting off with a small question. So I think that when I was younger, I used to think that kind of my passion needed to be very instrumental or targeted at a really important problem. And as I get a little older, I think that what makes the most sense maybe is to figure out what you really love in life and try to tie that up to a broader purpose, something bigger than you. And so maybe you love doing art, and or maybe you love doing music, or maybe you love talking to people. So, you know, those things can be used in a broader purpose, or maybe you like doing business or going into medicine. So if you go into medicine, maybe you could serve underprivileged communities, like undocumented workers who are picking up fruit. And if you go into art, maybe you can find a way to bring the art to communities that are often excluded from places like museums. I think whatever you do, as long as you hate poverty a little bit, I think you'll be doing a huge service to our country. I think housing is a foundational issue. I think without stable shelter, everything else does fall apart, and we need a lot more brains on this problem. But there's a lot of problems out there, and it's hard to pick just one, and I think that's good news for folks like you that are starting to think about larger careers, because it means that you can bind up your talents and your love and your gifts and not like submerge those things, but allow those things to flourish in the broader purpose of your joy, but also in broader public benefit. That's would be my humble advice.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emine.
Hi, Emine.
Yesterday, Ben Carson had an interview, and during that interview, he claimed that poverty was a mindset, and that if you put people on the right track to be winners, then they can achieve a lot and pull themselves out of poverty. And in your article, you also talked about, in your New York Times article, you talked about the mortgage income deduction and how that mainly benefited middle class and upper class people, and how it made it even harder for low-income families to become homeowners. And with these systems in place, and with the current administration, with somebody who thinks poverty is a mindset running the housing and urban development sector of our government, how do you see what policies need to be taken or brought into place to help low-income families move up and out of poverty when you have the mid, which is untouchable and seemingly difficult to work with administration currently.
Did all of you read that article, or did you just do it on your own?
I think
Most
a
of us
couple of
did.
us, most of us might have read it actually.
Okay. So I feel like there's two parts to your question. One is about Secretary Carson's comments, and the other one is about policies or upside down social policy when it comes to housing. With respect to Secretary's comments, that's an old idea, and for me, it's a very tired one. And you know, America is the richest democracy with the worst poverty. That's who we are. So there's no other advanced industrial society that has the kind of poverty that we do or the level of poverty that we do. So, you know, if all our poor folks started a country, that country would be bigger than Spain. And so the idea that this is a mindset, for me, contradicts and grinds against, like, if you believe that, if you really believe that, then you have to believe that there's something wrong with a vast number of Americans in a way that's qualitatively different than believing there's, you know, so then you say, well, why do Americans have a certain mindset that plunges them into poverty when a bunch of folks in Turkey or Argentina or Germany don't have that mindset? And I think that's a really difficult position to hold. I think that poverty does tax the mind, but I don't think people choose poverty. And I don't think that you can get out of poverty by willing yourself out in most cases. I also think that, you know, your kind of, you know, juxtaposition with that kind of comment with the fact that with respect to housing anyways, we give most of our public benefits to affluent families and none to most poor families that need it, shows how ironic a lot of this is. And it shows that how many of us are being helped by the government in ways that we don't see it. You know, many of you who live in mortgaged suburban homes benefit from like the biggest housing benefit that our country has. And most renters just sort of completely left out of any kind of help. And that seems upside down. And so for me anyways, if we're going to spend the bulk of our public dollars on the rich when it comes to housing, we should at least own that, you know, and talk honestly about that instead of repeating this idea that the richest country on the planet can't afford to do more, and also repeating this idea that all these Americans, 1 in 5 of our neighbors who can't afford basic necessities, are there because they somehow don't have the right attitude. That just seems patently false.
Thank you.
Hey, my name is Spencer. My question is going back to the mortgage interest deduction and the fact that we spend so much more on programs like these designed to help homeowners rather than people trying to find housing. So in the epilogue of your book, you mentioned that if we diverted $22.4 billion away from programs like MID to programs designed to help people find housing, then I believe you said we give the bottom 30% of people housing vouchers. So I'm just wondering, even like if this was feasible, if we could make this happen, what effect would this have on current homeowners who are on the brink of owning homes? Like, would some people lose their homes, and like, would the whole housing market change as a result of this?
So economists have looked into two questions that people claim about the mortgage interest deduction. One question is, does the deduction help people buy homes? Does it spur home ownership? And the answer is unequivocally no, it doesn't. And the reason is the biggest barrier to home ownership is like saving enough for a down payment, and the mortgage interest deduction does not help you with that problem. The other question they looked into is, does the mortgage interest deduction prop up property values? And the answer is yes, it does, absolutely. And it's because it incentivizes us to buy bigger and more expensive properties than we could if that benefit wasn't there, right? So if we have an after-tax savings that is linked to how big our mortgage is, and that savings gets bigger with our mortgage, that means like instead of buying a $500,000 house, now I can buy a $600,000 house, and that props up home values. So one suggestion that some reformers, both on the left and the right, have been walking around Washington is, why don't we cap the mortgage interest deduction, which is currently capped at $1 million? Why don't we cap it at $500,000 and redistribute that savings into affordable housing programs? So what would be that savings? That savings would be about $87 billion over 10 years. That would affect only 5% of mortgages. So how would it affect those mortgages? It would cause housing that's valued between $625,000 to $1.25 million probably to drop in value. So there's our trade-off. Would we be okay with that? Would we be okay with that? And would we be okay with having some of the most affluent Americans who own the most expensive homes take a bit of a hit to allow so many low-income families a shot at stable, affordable housing? I could live with that trade-off, but I think that's a national conversation about what we have to have. And for me, it speaks to a larger moral question, which is like poverty it's connected, right? We're all connected to this problem, and I think we need to search about how our lives and our schools and our neighborhoods and our tax returns are intimately connected to failing schools and bad neighborhoods and the lack of benefits that other folks have, and stop thinking about poverty as like this isolated thing, and thinking about it as something that we're all connected to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Desmond, I'm Neil.
Hi, Neil.
So my question for you is, in your book, you talked about how repeated 911 calls in low-income neighborhoods were treated by the police as almost a nuisance, even though they involve sometimes serious drug activity or domestic violence. So my question for you is, how do you think police departments would kind of react to the same activity if it occurred in a high-income neighborhood or a wealthy neighborhood? How does this kind of inequality kind of change the police behavior?
So we looked into that, and we found that if you call 911 a lot in a wealthy neighborhood, or even just a majority white neighborhood that isn't very wealthy, you still have a lot lower chance of being deemed a nuisance. So it seems that this law is interacting with racial and class differences, and incentivizing or producing certain properties getting the citation that behave in similar ways than other properties that are in more affluent neighborhoods or wider neighborhoods. To really nerd out with you on this question, it's really neighborhoods that are transitioning or gentrifying or on the edges of kind of change that have the highest propensity to get a nuisance ordinance all else equal. So that means that police are especially sensitive to what they deem as nuisances to properties that are more mixed or transitioning, which I think is interesting and telling. The good news about this is we've been able to change federal law and local law because of this finding or this discovery. And so I met with several senators a month after the book came out. They really latched onto that chapter in the book called A Nuisance. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, especially from Massachusetts, was like, we could do something about this. And so she rallied the troops and got 18 senators to sign a letter to HUD asking for guidance to be issued against these nuisances. And they did. They issued guidance, which put federal law back on the side of domestic violence survivors. So that's a win for us, and we've been able to change the law on the local level a lot through litigation, too, because the ACLU is just suing police departments because they think this is a violation of the Fair Housing Act and the Violence Against Women Act. That's just important to recognize because, a lot of times when we confront problems as big as this, they seem really intractable and what can we do about this? And, in my experience anyways, shedding light or bearing witness on these problems can really change the law.
Right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie.
Hi, Katie.
So in your book, you talk about the cyclic nature of evictions. How if you get evicted once, it makes it so much easier to be evicted again and again. My question kind of relates to the kids who experience these chronic evictions, and I was wondering if you repeatedly experience evictions as a kid, are you more prone to experiencing them as an adult?
We don't know the answer to that question. And there are a million questions that we don't know the answer to. And so, the effect of eviction on kids So I can tell you what I saw. I saw this one eviction toward the end of the book where Narlene is living with Trisha, right? And the movers come suddenly, and Arlene isn't expecting this. And Jory comes home from school, and he's like 7, right? So I have a 7-year-old. If I got evicted and my 7-year-old came home from school, he would freak out, right? If he saw that, he would freak out. He would run around. He would grab his favorite things. He would be like, what's going on? So Jory came home from school, and he looked at this scene, this chaotic scene, all these movers around, these strange men packing stuff up, his mom kind of racing around trying to get the medication and the phones and everything. And he didn't say anything. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for what's happening or run to get his favorite toy. He just turned around and went outside. And that was one of the most chilling and scaring things I saw, during this field work. And so what does that do? What's the long-term impact of something like this on his life? We don't know statistically. We need more hard data about this. What is the generational effect of eviction? Is someone who's more likely evicted as a kid, are they more likely to be evicted as an adult? We don't know. I do know that eviction in some parts of the country becomes so commonplace that people don't recognize it as a problem. And this I think you guys read Brian Stevenson's book, this volunteer class, and I think this is true for incarceration too, where incarceration for some folks in our country now is more common than college or going to the army. And so eviction has become that way. And there's a little line in the book where I'm asking Patrice Hingston, well, aren't you nervous about getting evicted? And she's like, not really, because everyone but my white friends has an eviction on their record. So it seems that it's become so commonplace, it's become normalized. And under those conditions, we could have the expectation that high prevalence of eviction in childhood would lead to high prevalence of eviction in adulthood. But we don't know.
All right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophie.
Hi.
So, recently healthcare has been something that's been highly talked about on the political agenda, but we just saw a lot of cuts to healthcare in America. Do you ever wonder if housing rights was something that was more talked about in politics and more people had attention on it, if it would just result in it being restricted and cut more than it already has?
Can you give me that last part one more time?
Sure. Do you ever worry that if housing rights were talked about more, more people were focusing on them in politics, if they would just end up being cut more than they already have, they would be restricted a lot more than they have already? If it would just be a problem more rather than a solution.
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people are talking about this issue that aren't the usual suspects, and so there's goodwill on both sides of the aisle on this issue. There's ignorance on both sides of the aisle on this issue in Washington. And then the problem has expanded so much that there are these coalitions building that are not the coalitions one would think. So I just met with Facebook yesterday, about the affordable housing crisis. And you said, why does Facebook care about the affordable housing crisis? Well, they're a company that's about community and bringing people together. But they're also in a really high-cost housing market, in the Bay Area, and they feel like they have to do something about that in their own backyards. Teachers are saying, look, 40% of my elementary kids that start on day one don't finish on the last day, and we have to stabilize these kids' homes, to give them a shot at full potential. Cops are getting engaged in this issue because they know that neighborhoods with more evictions have more violent crime that fall on here. If we care about civic engagement or politics, if we care about health, we have to understand that housing is itself like a vaccine. And we can spend smart, we can spend stupid. So if we don't want to spend on good housing, we can spend on higher levels of asthma and depression. So I think there's a lot of people that are coming around this issue that housing is central and it's at the bottom. It's like a spoke. It's like a hub issue. That whatever keeps you up at night, racial inequality, violence, or educational inequalities, the lack of stable, affordable housing is somewhere at the root of that issue. I think the more we talk about that, the more we come to broader bipartisan solutions.
Thank you.
Come on, Matt, I'm going to jump in for 1 second, but Adrienne is coming as well. I wonder if maybe Sophie's question is also rooted in the idea that it seemed like we had a consensus around putting people in jail, particularly with cases involving drugs. And then Sessions comes to the DOJ, and it seems like that gets wiped away very quickly. So I think that may be the context for that, if that makes sense.
I don't think Sessions. I don't think it's that easy. I mean, to wipe it away. There's been a large national movement, over the last 10 years to really rethink incarceration and de-incarceration, and I think it's troubling the statements that are coming out of the DOJ right now. But I also think, like, if you look at the numbers about states that are decarcerating, there's a lot more states that are losing prison population than are gaining them. And I think that's a trend that's going to continue. I hope that'd be something we see in HUD, too, where, even though we have statements like from Secretary Carson about poverty being a mindset, there's also other people in HUD that have really great ideas and are working really hard to affirm fair housing and affordable housing. So, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of flux in Washington these days, and it's kind of hard to get our heads around. But I don't know. Part of me believes in, the power of larger momentum that's been building over years, and it feels like housing is catching on with that. With that said, like, the Trump's budget issues a 17% cut to housing and urban development, which will result in the loss of hundreds of thousands of housing vouchers and increase homelessness across the country. So, and I guess for me, like, regardless of what happens to the Trump budget, if it goes through or not, as a statement about who we are as a society, it's not a society that I want to belong to. I don't want to belong to a society that privileges the affluent at the expense of cutting food stamps and housing and WIC benefits and disability benefits and student loan benefits to so many Americans that desperately need them and are deserving of them. As a moral statement, it's deeply troubling.
Hi, I'm Adriana. And
Yeah.
in your book, you have a line that goes, black men get locked in and black women get locked out. And this is an idea Brian Stevenson seems to agree with, though he seems to believe that this is due to the idea that slavery hasn't ended, it's just evolved to slavery, then segregation, and now the mass incarceration of black men. And I was wondering if you could draw any parallels between this idea of evolved slavery or internalized racism and black women and evictions.
So I wouldn't go as far as Brian to say that slavery hasn't ended, but I would say that it's absolutely true that the legacies of our systems of racial discrimination, subjugation, have left deep marks on the American present, and they haven't been fully reconciled. And with housing, the easy one here is, like, most white families own their own home, and most Black and Latino families don't. And that's a direct result of our legacies of racial discrimination. In the African American case, you can see just a systematic dispossession of Black folks from the land. From slavery to sharecropping to the northern migration to the creation of the northern ghetto to redlining that left a lot of Black folks out of the private mortgage market to the exclusion of the GI Bill and New Deal, which helped a lot of white veterans enter into the middle class through home ownership, on and on. You can kind of see this, and that's why you have these statistics like we do today. And so I think that's absolutely right. In eviction in particular, I do think you see this parallelism with incarceration, and I do think you see this kind of they're both violent, traumatic, consequential events that become ridiculously commonplace in the lives of poor African American men and poor African American women. Among Milwaukee renters, 1 in 5 Black women is evicted at some time in her life, compared to 1 in 15 white women, which is crazy and should startle us and stir us. So I think that, like, I think that, to fully understand American life, you're right. Like we have to understand the legacies of racial domination in our country and how they still are very much alive and well in people's lives today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tavi. So it's predicted that within the next couple decades, over half or about half of American jobs will become automated. And when that happens, the government will have to find a way to provide a security, like a safety net for individuals without jobs. So taking automation into mind, do you believe that a system like universal basic income could have the potential to solve the housing crisis, given that current programs such as food stamps don't really provide necessary like funds for housing and stuff like that?
I don't know. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question. The universal basic income conversation is an old one, but it's really kind of caught fire recently in the last 5 years, mostly on the West Coast. And, social scientists debate those numbers about automation and the effect they'll have on the labor force. Some folks think that will fundamentally change work in America and the world, and some folks think that we'll adopt, just like we did after the Industrial Revolution and other kinds of like technological revolutions. So I think economists, the jury's still out, with that kind of question. I think a larger question that you're asking is like, if we address, how should we address poverty? Should we think of it as incomes? Should we think of it as expenditures like housing? And for me, it has to be both. And a little kind of a universal basic income kind of a miniature program that we have is something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Do you guys know what this is? It's like a giant welfare benefit for working poor families. So every working poor family in America is entitled to this thing called the EITC, which is designed to boost them above the poverty line, right? And so it's the idea that if you work in America, you shouldn't be poor. And so you get the EITC, you get that benefit one time in February. So if you look at eviction rates, like in cities, every year they just plunge in February, right? Which is like a bummer, I think, because you have this benefit that's designed to lift people above the poverty line. But if we don't control like things like their housing costs, all it does is become eviction prevention insurance. So for me, we have to fix the floor. We have to think about wages and good jobs and living incomes. But we also have to fix the ceiling. Because if the ceiling moves with the floor, then our efforts are diluted at best.
Thank you.
Come on, guys.
So, hi, I'm Emily.
I'm Gray. We're
And-
the last
yeah,
two
we're the last
questions.
So, I'll go first. You said earlier that you met with some congressmen and women and you were able to get a policy change about advantages for domestic abuse survivors. So, have you had any other policy changes or pushes since the publication of your book?
Yeah, I mean, most books don't, and but this one has had the benefit of seeing kind of tangible results even a year after publication. So, we've changed the law about domestic violence and nuisance ordinances, both at the federal level, but a lot of local levels too. The ACLU has started a campaign called I'm Not a Nuisance, which is directly about this issue, and they're kind of just taking it on. They're on a tear about getting these things wiped off our books. Then we've also seen cities take up suggestions that Evicted presented, like the right to counsel in housing court. So New York City just passed the first ever right to counsel in housing court last month. I testified in favor of that, and they're going to do it. So every single tenant in New York City pretty soon, if they go to eviction court, will have a lawyer on their side. Philadelphia is now considering that kind of approach too. I think that's a huge step in the right direction. And then there's just broader conversations that are happening at the city level in Seattle and Houston and Pittsburgh and all over about what cities could do to confront the affordable housing crisis. And I'm glad that the book has done a bit of its part to stir and contribute to this conversation.
At some point in your book, you mentioned that at some point in American history, like housing really picked up steam, and public housing for people below the poverty line. but eventually that kind of died out to the point where like these high rises were kind of run down and people stopped funding them and that kind of thing. But you still propose that we continue the public housing and public vouchers for people. What do you think we can do this time? What do you think will happen this time so that doesn't happen again, so that the funding doesn't stop and it's maintainable?
So I think that that's an important perspective to keep in mind. You know, public housing is seen as like this colossal public policy failure in America. You know, we built these huge towers in segregated areas, and then we stopped funding them, and they descended into chaos and ruin. And, you know, in some cities, you know, they were destroyed only 18 years after they were constructed. And so most folks view public housing as like, we tried and we failed. But you take anything and you remove the money, it's going to fail. Like having firefighters is probably a good idea in your town, but if you don't fund them, they're not going to be able to do their job. And so I think that's important. And if you read transcripts from the first residents who moved into public housing, they're like, this is amazing. This is incredible. This is such a gift, because what public housing replaced was slums. You know, we had a lot of slums in our country not too long ago, about 2 generations ago. And so, you know, for those slums to be cleared and replaced by this decent, affordable housing was a huge part of the progressive agenda. And then it just got gutted, mainly through the Reagan era, and then destroyed. Now, what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again? That's a really hard question. I mean, there's a lot of slashing going on at the federal level right now. And so some people have said, well, let's move to the cities. Let's get stuff done in the cities and kind of rely on states and cities to raise their own revenue and do their own public goods. And so cities have done things from issuing a little bit more tax so they can raise more money for affordable housing programs. Portland and Seattle have done this, for example, to actually having the businesses fund their own affordable housing voucher programs, because they know their workforce can't afford to live in the city and they need to stick around. So there's a lot of creative things going on at the local level. I think we can't fix this problem with a little bitty nudge solution. We're bleeding out, so a Band-Aid isn't going to do it. So we do need significant federal investment in this problem. But that's a hard political question and problem right now, especially with the administration that seems to be intent on cutting benefits to poor people. With respect to public housing, we've learned how to do it better. You know, there's scattered site public housing. If you tour public housing in D.C. or San Francisco or Milwaukee, it's awesome. You'd be like, I would live here. This is great. And we've learned from our past mistakes. The problem with our programs isn't in their design, it's in their dosage. You know, we just don't fund it at a level that we need to.
Right.
Okay, well, I want to come in with two last things. The first is, I told the students that if we Skype with you, they would all get into Harvard. Is that true?
I don't think they need the Skype to do that. I was so impressed by their questions and their engagement and their letters. Thank you so much for those. You know, I'm sure y'all are Harvard bound or bound to other universities that are equally good and amazing. So what an incredible group of minds. Thank you so much for engaging this issue so deeply.
Yeah, I want to end on that note. You know, you talked about having an impact through your book. And the indexes you mentioned are really important. I don't mean this in a corny or cheesy way, but I would say I know of one student, a girl who just finished her first year in college, who her life plans were changed by your book. I mean, to me, that's profound and that matters, and that's the goal of an educator, right? And I can tell you in this room, there are a lot of students who felt the book had a profound impact on them and their understanding of society and fairness. So, man, just from a deep level, we want to thank you for writing such an extraordinary book and for taking the time with us today.
I think that reaction means a lot, and it means that I've tried to convey, the deep humanity of people like Lorraine and Arlene. And I think that if you guys are responding to the book, it's because you're responding to their lives. And I think that they're the ones who really should be thanked, and they're the ones who really are helping to bring this issue to light at the national level. So thanks, you guys. This was really great.
Y'all, can we say goodbye?
Bye.
Thanks, man. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was fun. We always do the same thing. Okay, so you stand up. Cool, stand up. There we go. And we always focus not on what it'd be like, because that's fleeting and not very important.